I begin with an article that you wrote this past month for the Dispatch. It's titled "The Most Important Thing You Read Today." And the subtitle, it's about diversity training and it's not by me, which is great. Like, open this, but don't read everything I'm about to say because I want you to click into something further.
Yeah.
This is great. This was super interesting. You cite a piece by Jesse Singal. Is that how you say his name?
Singal, yes.
And he's written about research that's uncovered the ineffectiveness of diversity training. And this launches you into a wider conversation around what we think really matters and happens. But let's begin with Jesse Singal's piece on diversity training. What did he uncover that was so interesting?
Yeah, what he uncovered is that diversity training doesn't really work. And to the extent that it has an effect on people, it's often negative. There's often a backlash attached to it. And this is something that's been kind of a dirty little secret for a while now, is that that diversity training doesn't really do a lot.
Well, but before we get into it not doing a lot, what do people hope it does? What is the goal of I mean, we've probably all been a part of these in some form or another, but what's stated as being the perceived goal or outcome of diversity training?
Well, you've raised the great question. Okay. Because I got pushback from some folks saying, well, it depends on what you're wanting out of it. So if you're wanting something very, very modest out of it, in other words, you say, well, this is something that's sort of a signaling mechanism to just sort of say, we take diversity seriously, or this is a CYA measure for litigation that is saying, look, we have fully trained our employees in anti-harassment concepts and DEI. Well, then if your goals are very, very modest or perhaps superficial, then diversity training can, quote, work.
Right, but covering your rear end in a lawsuit situation, basically.
Covering your rear end, box checking, right. Or maybe something less tangible but still meaningful, where you're saying, look, we have a diverse workforce and we're signaling to our diverse workforce that we take diversity seriously, that there's a signaling mechanism. So if your objectives are super, super modest, and in those circumstances often unmeasurable, then okay, I can get the argument that it works. But if your objectives are diversity training as a means of fundamentally changing attitudes, in other words, changing the way people view issues of race and gender and sexuality and things like that, or if your view is that diversity training is sort of a mechanism for an indispensable mechanism, for example, in, say, increasing diversity, that it is a necessary step for increasing diversity. Again, the evidence for that is really lacking. So it doesn't appear to really change corporate culture. It doesn't appear to really change individual hearts and minds. And it doesn't appear to really be that instrumental in changing the composition of workforces, you know, as a tool in the toolbox of sort of diversifying workforces. And so basically, all of the things that you would want in a program that would be truly impactful, it doesn't accomplish. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't exceptions to this rule, that there might be individual trainers or individual trainings that might be better than others. And Singal found that if training is voluntary, in other words, participants are really willingly coming into the training, in other words, are predisposed to want to receive the message, it might be more impactful. But this sort of mandatory diversity training world just isn't impactful.
So my interest in this piece, and I think it's your interest as well, is not so much in diversity training itself.
Right.
It's in the assumption we carry widely that we can form people into the views and beliefs that we think are best with a programmatic approach.
Yes.
And we do that in our corporations, in our schools and universities, in our churches and ministries. Mm-hmm. We think if we just employ the right content in the right program, people will come out the other side like some kind of spiritually formative, mechanized industrial factory. They'll come out the other end as this person we want them to be. So the article you cite shows, well, that's not exactly what's happening with diversity training in corporate settings. You cite the fear that a lot of Christian parents have about sending their children to secular universities and colleges, that it's going to deprogram them from the faith and make them into these secular robots. The data says that's not true either, that kids who go to these universities with faith actually hold on to faith at higher rates than one might expect. So what's your big takeaway then from this phenomenon that none of these things seem to be as either effective or as dangerous as we make them out to be?
Yeah. So there are multiple pretty important takeaways here. And another one I used was fertility. So we have this huge issue of declining fertility, not just in the US, but worldwide in advanced nations, advanced economies. And everyone says, here's this program that'll work, and this program, and this
Japan
program.
has tried all kinds of really crazy stuff.
All kinds of stuff. I mean, paying people, bonuses when they have children, to cradle to grave healthcare, to extended leave. I mean, we've so many, and sometimes you might see a marginal bump here or there, but fundamental change doesn't happen. And so there's so many interesting takeaways from this. One is we often fight intensely, and this was sort of how I led this. We often fight really intensely over things that, truth be told, aren't that consequential. And so the diversity training example, a lot of more progressive people hope that it transforms hearts and minds. And a lot of conservatives, especially when you're getting to sort of more critical race theory informed versions of diversity training, fear that it changes hearts and minds when it doesn't fulfill the hopes, nor does it, enact the fears. It's just kind of there. And similarly with college, there's this sort of incredible emphasis, and you see this in conservative Christian spaces, where what do you say to parents who are about to send their kids to college, right? And I get this question all the time, and I've started with a 2-word response: fear not. Fear not. And one of the reasons why they should fear not is it actually turns out that, and it's been the case for generations, that college-educated people are more religious than non-college educated.
Right.
And so it is not this factory of secularization. And conversely, to folks in the sort of the activist part of academia, they really believe that they are engines of fundamental change in the students, and sometimes act accordingly, inflaming culture wars in their own right when they're not. And so it really does, I think in one sense, it is both empowering and disempowering in different ways. So it's disempowering in the sense that, look, guys, there's no 5-point plan, here for revitalizing the church, or there's no 5-point plan for racial reconciliation and harmony. It's not that policy doesn't matter at all. It's just that it's not got the weight, the change. It's not the change agent that you think it is. And then what's empowering is what does change us, what does build us, construct us, and mold us. Turns out, the good old-fashioned close friends, family, intimate relationship dynamics still really, really, really matters.
So when I read this piece, I immediately put my ministry hat back on, my pastor hat, because when I was in pastoral ministry, and even years following that, when I was at Christianity Today and reporting on a lot of ministries, this mindset is everywhere in the ministry world. Everyone's looking for the off-the-shelf solution to make disciples, or to reach non-believers, or to grow the church, or to transform young people's lives. And everyone's trying to sell that as the prepackaged, here's what you need to do. Thinking back to the late 2010s, early teens, Willow Creek did a big study that they branded and published under the name Reveal. I don't know if you ever encountered this.
No.
But they hired some outside firm, spent a lot of money to first investigate their own congregation. And then they expanded this to 500, and I think ultimately around 5,000 congregations around the U.S. And the simple task was, what has been proven to help people love God and love their neighbor more? Which of our programs, what activities that we're doing as a church are really moving the needle on what they diagnose to be the core of the faith. And what they came back with was really fascinating. Essentially, it boiled down to 4 things.
Okay.
1 was regular engagement with the Bible, reading the Bible regularly. 2 was prayer. 3 was a meaningful relationship with a mentor, a spiritual mother or father in your life. And 4, some outlet of service toward others. Not necessarily in the church, but just a place where you are contributing and serving others. Those 4 things. And Willow put out this video about this research and the jaw-dropping reality of these findings, where they realized everything we're doing is, we build these $80 million buildings and these huge elaborate programs, and yet it's these 4 simple activities. And the executive pastor at the time, Greg Hawkins, had this whiteboard paper, and he like tore off the sheet and said, we're starting with a brand new sheet. We're going to rejigger everything from the ground up around these 4 things. And eventually they did this whole conference on it. They rolled out, I reported on it numerous times at CT. And then after about 2 years, it all just kind of disappeared. Like you didn't hear anything about Reveal for a while. And I went to some of my sources, my back end sources, like, what happened to Reveal? Where'd it go? And what I was told was, well, the problem with Reveal was you can't really sell anything. You can't sell a program. You can't sell, there's no commercial product based on those 4 things. You don't need an $80 million building to do those 4 things.
Yeah.
And so that's where, and then slowly the megachurch movement, others are reverting back to, well, where's the program? Where's the agenda? Where's the thing I can buy and sell and the conference ticket I can get? And so it was just interesting to me, similar to your article, like we want to believe that we can control these outcomes a lot more than we can. And it's like this forever, it's like the fountain of youth. Someone's always ready to sell it to you, even though it never works.
Well, and I've written in the past about sort of a basic principle, which is you can have a lot of influence over a small number of people, and very little influence over a large number of people.
Yeah,
and we often, especially in hyper political times, we flip our emphasis. We flip what really motivates us. Now, there are some people who are professionally in politics or commentary, like we are, and it's kind of our business to speak to lots of people. But even for us, where it's our business to speak to large numbers of people, it really should still be our fundamental life focus of the people right around us in arm's length. That should be our fundamental life focus. And going to that message, what's interesting is it is really hard to make that level of friendship and intimacy programmatic.
Right.
And churches try, the small group phenomenon, which can be really great. And if you're like me, Skye, you've been in some that were really not.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, but the really good small groups I've been a part of have arisen organically, often out of pre-existing friend groups, find sort of extending a little bit and adding mutual friends, and it can be really, really wonderful. But it's that closeness, it's that intimacy that really matters. And this tracks on all kinds of fronts. It's not just church, for example, but when we're looking at the phenomenon of deaths of despair, where we're really trying to find what's the programmatic solution to all these drug addictions, to all this drug addiction, to the suicide, to the alcoholism. What's programmatic? What can we do? Well, you can distribute Narcan widely, and that can help, but it doesn't heal the heart. And what you're finding is, if when you break down and you see who is it that is killing themselves, who is it that is dying of drug overdoses, again and again it comes back to, while all demographics are effective, single men are affected more than any other demographic, both never been married and married and divorced. And it's that lack of intimacy, it's that lack of relationship that is just so crippling.
And that's also what's so terrifying about trying to correct it. Because, like you said, whether it's a church or a societal example, we may be able to create settings or environments where those kinds of relationships may transpire, where they could coalesce, but you can't guarantee it. You can't make it happen. And as we see our society become more and more atomized, and young people especially who are not equipped for basic social interaction because of the influence of social media and devices on these young minds, they're not equipped to do the very thing that's necessary for human flourishing and mental health. Yeah. And then we look for a national solution, a programmatic solution, a political solution, a school solution, and none of them are adequate to really tackle what we're trying to do. And I'm not advocating that we don't do anything. Yeah. But my father's a physician, and he's talked to me all my life about the fact I remember when I was in middle school or high school, one time he came home from work and he's just like, I have to get out of this country. And he left for a week or two to go overseas to do some kind of medical missions work thing. He's not even a Christian, but he did it anyway. And when he got back, I asked him why. And he said, I'm so tired of dealing with patients where all their health problems are self-induced lifestyle issues. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to go overseas where I'm helping people who are sick or diseased for no fault of their own. It's not because they ate too much or drank too much or smoked too much, but because, just natural diseases. And it's a little bit like that when you've spent your whole life in an environment where everything around you is malformative. It's really hard to then put a program in place that's going to change that. And that seems like what we're often trying to do, whether it's on the issues of race or personal health or relational dynamics. We're looking for a government or cultural solution to things, which the ship may have already sailed.
Well, and then if it comes through politics often, if it codes to the right or codes to the left, it's immediately alienating to millions of people that you're wanting to reach or wanting to help. And, the more I look into, and let's just peel back from sort of race and racial reconciliation and move to the masculinity issue and masculinity crisis, where we have this really sad situation in America where there's a bifurcation in outcomes of young men and boys. And that is, it's sort of at the top of American society, boys do really well. They're still disproportionately in corporate boardrooms. They're disproportionately political leaders. They're disproportionately at sort of this apex of society. But once you move past the elite ranks, boys are really struggling.
Yeah, fewer boys in college now than girls, I believe.
By a long shot.
Yeah.
And really having trouble with educational attainment, really having trouble with mental health. And when you drill down into it, what you see for an awful lot of folks is that boys are really impacted by loss of fathers. Mm-hmm. Really impacted by that. They're also young men are really impacted, and men are really impacted by loss of friendships. And as we've seen, they're really impacted by loss of relationships with women. And so what's the government program to make you a father, friend, or husband? What's that government program that makes you a good father, a good friend, or a good husband? And that's where, and it's really fascinating. There's a study a couple of years ago that showed that boys do better in neighborhoods where there are more fathers, even if boys don't have a father.
Yeah.
Because of that mentoring, right? And that exposure. And so if a big part of the masculinity crisis is just too few guys are fathers or husbands or friends or have friends, what's your 5-point plan for that?
Right.
And then if you try to filter the masculinity crisis through, well, to really deal with the masculinity crisis, we have to destroy the left. Well, that ain't it. That's not what's going to do it.
It reminds me, back in the Obama administration, I was invited to the White House for a series of meetings with a bunch of other faith leaders from all different traditions, because President Obama had an initiative around fatherhood. And having grown up without his father and recognizing especially the impact that fatherlessness was having on African-American communities, he wanted to tackle this. But in all those meetings, the administration representatives were, I think, pretty honest. And they went through all of the costs of fatherlessness on society. Mm-hmm. And most of those costs end up in the government's sector, right? With higher rates of addiction, dropouts from school, imprisonment, violent crime for young men, all this kind of stuff ends up costing taxpayers more money. And yet the administration was honest in saying, we cannot create programs to fix this. which is why we've invited you all here, faith leaders, because we need churches and synagogues and religious groups and clubs engaging in these communities and creating mentoring relationships, because at the end of the day, if you do that, it's going to be better for everyone. And that was coming from the Obama administration, which is, everyone sees as a more progressive liberal thing, but they also recognize the limits of what government action can do. The other thing that comes to mind is years ago, there was a professor that we interviewed. I forget where he was at, but he had spent decades interviewing. It was a Christian university where he taught, and he had spent decades asking college freshmen to write a brief testimony about their faith and what was most influential. And he collected these things for 30 some years, and he looked for common themes throughout these stories. And what he concluded was that for these young people, I think men and women, what he concluded was the most important people in their life that shaped their views and faith by the time they were in their 20s was not their parents, but what he described as a peer of their parents. So a coach or a teacher or a pastor or somebody of their parents' generation who nonetheless was mentoring or befriending that young person, because we all know by the time your kids are teenagers or young adults, mom and dad are idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. But a peer of the parent has a deep, deep influence. And so to create environments where those kinds of relationships are more likely to occur is really important for the formation of young people. So even not having a father at home, like you said, those environments where young people are encountering other older men who can function in a fatherly way makes a huge, huge difference.
And the people who are really smart in this space, they know everything that you just said. They know how important a coach can be, right? They know how important a friend's dad can be, even if you and your dad are somewhat estranged or whatever. They know all of this. They know how important good peer relationships are. But how do you, and you'll hear this in philanthropy a lot, this phrase, scalability.
Right.
You know, if you know a really good coach is really important, well, you can't pass, here's our 5-year, $50 billion good coach package that we're going to, and that, you know, that kind of scalability of intimacy, it's a contradiction in terms, right? This sort of idea that, well, from the top down, you can scale up these close, positive, close personal relationships. Now, you can do things that, where you can do things that make it easier to have good schools or to have good schooling environments. You can do things to sort of make it to where government isn't an impediment and can maybe nudge here and there in some positive ways. Again, no one's saying policy doesn't matter at all. It's just rarely does it get at the heart of the matter of these really profound issues of the heart and mind.
Okay, last question on this before we move on. What are the implications of this then for the culture wars? Because it feels like so much of our culture warring is built on the assumption that if we can just get control of X, this institution or this policy or this narrative in the culture, it will shape hearts and minds in the direction that we want it to go. That's the argument from both the left and the right. Does this just undermine culture war entirely as not just harmful, but irrelevant?
I would say it undermines culture war, not to say that it's completely irrelevant, because religious liberty matters, for example, but it is not nearly as relevant and material to our lives as we tend to believe. And so what ends up happening is you kind of have this continual Lucy with the football phenomenon, where 20, 25 years ago, I'm in rooms where Christian leaders are saying, if we can achieve A, B, C, and D in religious liberty doctrine, we'll be golden. Yeah. And guess what? We didn't just achieve A, B, C, and D. We achieved A, B, C, D, a bonus C, and a bonus F. and church attendance keeps declining. There is, every generation from boomers down is less church attending than the generation before it. And so then now, well, religious liberty didn't do it. Well, it's got to be, we got to have more power. Now we got to really shape the culture. This is the rise of Christian nationalism, right? Well, we need to we need to make government more Christian, and that'll do it. Whereas 15 years ago, the conviction was, if you just get government out of our way and give us the full liberty to evangelize, that'll do it. And so there's always sort of this new thing that is the thing that will reverse cultural decline, transform hearts and minds, when it's all so much more complicated than that.
Everyone's looking for the silver bullet, and everyone's trying to sell the silver bullet.
Right.